Egyptian Book of the Dead, Becoming God in Ancient Egypt, Part 2, The Production and Use. Chapter 5, How a Book of the Dead manuscript was produced by Holger Kaufman. Unquestionably, the Book of the Dead is not only the most common of all funerary spell corpuses, but also the best attested kind of non-administrative Egyptian document in general. In terms of text witnesses, it outnumbers any other text composition by far. While most Egyptian literary works, such as wisdom text or tales, have been preserved only in a limited number of copies, the Book of the Dead is attested on hundreds of papyri and mummy wrappings, as well as on the walls of tombs and temples, ostraca, stelae, and even on wooden tablets. Due to its numerous attestations and long history, which extend over more than 1400 years, no other text or spell corpus seems so well suited for examining scribal habits and their development. On close examination, many copies of the Book of the Dead grant us intriguing insights into the methods of their production. Writing support. Papyrus was the most common writing material for the Book of the Dead exemplars, followed by linen. The papyrus roll consisted of numerous joined single sheets and was normally inscribed only on one side, preferably on the so-called recto, with horizontal papyrus fibers. The height of papyrus rolls ranges from about 20 to 40 centimeters. The length depended on the individually chosen number of spells. Only exceptionally, a Book of the Dead copy was distributed over more than one papyrus roll or written on different sorts of media, such as papyrus and a leather roll. The Book of the Dead of Nespasifi was written on at least three, probably four separate papyrus rolls. For Book of the Dead mummy wrappings, scribes usually chose a relatively fine linen. In the early New Kingdom, such exemplars were written on large shrouds, whereas in the late and Ptolemaic periods, long and mostly rather narrow mummy bandages were preferred. Generally, the last mentioned strips of linen were not woven in this format, but torn from large sheets. Sometimes the deceased was provided with two separate Book of the Dead copies, one on papyrus and one on linen wrappings. Figure 5.1 is a palimpsest papyrus that belonged to Buhar with a previous text erased in preparation for Book of the Dead spells that were never inscribed. A few spells prescribe that a new papyrus should be used as writing ground for Book of the Dead text. In practice, however, this was not always observed. Though papyrus might not have been as exorbitantly expensive as often is assumed, the Book of the Dead copyists sporadically reused discarded administrative papyrus rolls for their work. Either the original text on the recto was washed off or the Book of the Dead was written on the back or verso side. Even Book of the Dead papyri were recycled. If the intended owner did not purchase the copy for some reason, his name was erased or painted over and substituted with that of another person. Script and vignettes. Text and accompanying images were arranged in the Book of the Dead copies according to certain conventions, with more or less fixed types of layout. This relatively strict formal organization is a distinctive feature of Book of the Dead documents. The typical layout of hieroglyphic Book of the Dead documents with framing lines, vertical text columns, and fields for vignettes was developed in the 18th dynasty. The principles of arranging text in vignettes did not change fundamentally, at least for hieroglyphic documents, until the end of the Book of the Dead tradition. One would expect that Book of the Dead scribes and illustrators, especially those with little working experience, were trained how to copy spells and draw the elements of the vignettes accurately in accordance with established patterns. At present, however, we do not have clear evidence for such trial pieces. The typical writing support for scribal exercises were ostraca. One may think of the many New Kingdom excerpts from literary texts, which have been written on potsherds and stone flakes for this purpose. In contrast, texts from the Book of the Dead or other funerary corpuses have rarely been preserved on ostraca. The extant examples are most likely drafts or serve another purpose rather than being exercises. A good example for funerary spells on ostraca as drafts are 8 ostraca from the 18th dynasty, which are inscribed with a coherent sequence of coffin text spells. These ostracas served as a decorator's intermediate copy for transferring the text onto the walls of the burial chamber in the Theban tomb, TT 87 of Noctimin. Likewise, the judgment scene of Book of the Dead spell 125, drawn on an ostracon, can be interpreted as a draft for a scene in a tomb. Shared with the Book of the Dead text of a ritual nature, such as spell 137, a spell for causing a flame to ascend, might have functioned as recitation aids for the practitioners when they performed the underlying rite. When making a Book of the Dead papyrus, the first working step would be drawing the framing lines before the text and their accompanying pictures would be inserted. This is not only the most logical order, but also proven by cases in which the scripts overlaps the framing. In the New Kingdom, the upper and lower double or triple lines of the framing are often colored red and yellow, sometimes also blue. This is a practice for border lines, which we also encounter in the layout of temple walls. In late period and Ptolemaic Book of the Dead papyri, the lines are only drawn in black ink. Very rarely, auxiliary lines were used for the lines of text. During the New Kingdom, Book of the Dead exemplars with cursive hieroglyphs in vertical lines were standard, whereas hieratic text with horizontal lines are only found exceptionally. From the third intermediate period, the latter become more and more common with their own specific layouts, in which the text is interspersed with vignettes. Hieroglyphic examples are still found in the Ptolemaic period. However, intermediary manuscripts are rare, such as a 25th dynasty hieroglyphic example. But from Saitic Egypt, only hieratic copies are known at present. A widespread phenomenon of hieroglyphic New Kingdom and Ptolemaic Book of the Dead documents is retrograde writing. The signs face the end of the text and not, as usual, its beginning. The reasons for this practice remain uncertain. Headings, opening formula, and certain other elements were habitually written in red, while the main text of the spells was executed in black. The rubrics were added in a second step after the black text was written. Sometimes the rubrics were forgotten. In comparison to papyri, red ink is only rarely found in Book of the Dead documents on mummy wrappings. Exceptionally, white pigment was used to overwrite the original red hieratic text on an amuletic papyrus of the 19th dynasty with a single Book of the Dead spell. The illuminations of the Book of the Dead, the so called vignettes, are no mere decorative elements. They transmit the content of a spell in a condensed form and thus intensify the magical power of the spell to which they belong. The first Book of the Dead documents, in the proper sense, which are preserved on large sheets of mummy linen from the dawn of the New Kingdom, do only consist of two without illustrations. Since the mid 18th dynasty, illumination is a regular feature, and about 50% of all Book of the Dead copies have vignettes. Polychrome vignettes occur only on papyrus and on some 18th dynasty linen sheets, whereas they are very uncommon on the late period and Ptolemaic narrow mummy bandages. A few vignettes are conventionally scaled to full page size, for instance, the opening scene in figure 3.3. Most have a much smaller format and occupy considerably less space than the text to which they belong. Frequently, the vignettes show traces of pre preparatory sketches in red, which were covered by the final version in black. First, the draft was drawn in red outline, then the colors were applied, and then the final black outline was added. Um, for figures and parts of figures in red outline, C. Monroe. Da, 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 da. Sometimes all vignettes, sometimes only the large vignettes were colored. Among the minerals for pigments that have been identified are Egyptian blue, potassium lead chloride plus calcite white, and potassium lead chloride plus hematite pink, but also precious substances like cinnabar, red, orange, realgar, and orpiment, yellow. Gilding was used occasionally for certain details of the figures in New Kingdom, late period, and Ptolemaic Book of the Dead images. Text and illustrations were carried out in two consecutive steps. Presumably, these tasks lay in the responsibility of two different specialists, a scribe and a draftsman, though it cannot be ruled out that the same person produced both text and illustrations one after the other. The order was not fixed. We know of unfinished Book of the Dead documents in which only the vignettes have been executed. The draftsman had begun, and the text should have been written in another step, yet was never added. Other papyri bear texts of spells but did not, or just partly, receive their images. In the 26th dynasty papyrus of Nes Pasifi, only the vignette of spell 1 was begun. Due to work sharing during the manufacturing process, it could happen that text and vignettes were not properly coordinated, so a spell would not receive its prescribed image and vice versa. As an attempt to avoid misplacements, we encounter occasionally different sorts of notes, which offered some guidance to the draftsman as to where he should add which vignette or where he should not draw an image. In a third intermediate period papyrus, short marginalia hieroglyphic marks give information about what image had to be added as vignette, such as falcon, lotus, bark, and others. The papyrus of Kamhor bears a more general short hieratic instruction to insert the vignettes into the empty allocated spaces in accordance with the accompanying text. In Book of the Dead papyrus, Berlin P 3026, the compartments left empty by receiving the vignettes were numbered in red from 1 to 66 by the scribe as some sort of help for the draftsman who would know from the numeration which illustration he should add. A demotic note in a blank area below a spell of papyrus, Ryerson, category number 14, had quite the opposite intention. It marked an area where no vignette should be filled, stating it is not an empty space for a picture. Other short notes were added for the purpose of controlling completeness. To this group belong the numbers on the beginning of Book of the Dead mummy bandages, and also a notice which confirms the spell text is written on the end of the bandage after the long vignette of spell 17 at the beginning of the wrapping. Figure 5.6. Workshops, scribes, and draftsmen. Centers of Book of the Dead production were Memphis, Thebes, and Akhmim, though documents have come to light also from other sites. The establishments in which these Book of the Dead documents were made remain obscure, however. Probably they were not separate, specialized institutions, but located in the environment of the scriptoria of the temples. In a few cases, it is at least possible to securely attribute several individual manuscripts to the same scriptorium or even to the same scribe on the basis of vignette style, ductus of the script, and other peculiarities that they have in common. For example, we know that the same copyist who wrote the hieratic spells on mummy wrappings of Hor has also inscribed the Book of the Dead mummy wrappings of two other persons. Such linen Book of the Dead documents were apparently produced in the same studios like the exemplars on papyrus. This may be concluded from the papyrus and mummy wrappings of Samtek, son of Harak. Either the bandages have been copied directly from the Book of the Dead papyrus, or both may derive from the same master copy. Although the existence of workshops or some other kind of well organized institution in which Book of the Dead exemplars were made can be presumed, the scribes and draftsmen remain anonymous. All we can say is that a team of several experienced scribes and painters must have been members of the scriptorium. The creation of the Book of the Dead as a spelled corpus and its subsequent reorganization, especially in the 26th dynasty, surely took place in the Temple Milut. Priests must have kept copies of the Book of the Dead in the temple archive, from which its text and vignettes found their way not only to the Book of the Dead workshops, but also into temple decoration. It is well conceivable that also the scriptoria in which Book of the Dead exemplars were copied onto papyrus and linen for the burial of private individuals were situated in the environment of the temple. Many owners of Book of the Dead documents hold priestly titles, some of which are explicitly related to scribing and copying. These individuals may have been the scribes and draftsmen who made Book of the Dead documents for themselves and others. Also, the use of hieroglyphs testifies to highly specialized, if not priestly, scribes active in the workshops. Some Book of the Dead documents of considerable length have been produced by one single scribe only, while others were the work of several, like the early Ptolemaic Papyrus of Hor, which was written by at least four copiers. Sometimes more than one artist seems to have been involved in executing the vignettes, for example, in the Papyrus of Ani, one of the most famous New Kingdom Book of the Dead documents. The manuscript was prefabricated in several sections by a number of scribes and draftsmen before the decorated parts were glued together into a single roll. This complex teamwork between various highly specialized individuals reveals a significant degree of routine and professionalism in the workshops. Nevertheless, both the text and its images can display significant differences in quality depending on the ability of scribe and draftsman. Such discrepancies can occur even within the same Book of the Dead manuscript, maybe because not only mature copyists, but only apprentices were involved in the making of the copy. We do not know the average daily workload accomplished by the scribes and painters and can only guess how long it took to complete an extensive and sumptuous Book of the Dead exemplar. Probably one should expect no less than a couple of weeks. Exemplars produced on stock and on order. Most Book of the Dead papyri were purchased by men, except for the third intermediate period when owners of funerary papyri were predominantly women. For these owners, the manuscripts were either produced on order or on stock. The latter are usually easy to recognize as the scribes left empty spaces where the departed is normally mentioned in the text. When the manuscript was acquired, the owner's names, titles, and affiliation were filled in, frequently in a hand other than that of the main spelled text. Occasionally, the scribes forgot to supplement the name of the owner in some of the lacunae left for this purpose. This can be observed here and there in the famous Turin Book of the Dead papyrus of Iufonk, published by Lepsius in 1842. Sometimes the allocated empty spaces did not suffice to receive the name of the owner in its entirety, which had to be continued above the line. Master copies, local traditions, and compilations of individual Book of the Dead exemplars. The sheer mass of witnesses allows us to gain a solid idea about recurring and standard features in Book of the Dead manuscripts and to distinguish more unusual constituents. On this basis, we may draw conclusions on the models which were used in the workshops for duplicating the Book of the Dead. Master copies were apparently not uniform geographically and chronologically, nor were they models to follow slavishly and absolutely. Though the Book of the Dead may appear as a stereotypical collection of funerary spells, it was nevertheless open for individual modifications, especially with regard to the length and choice of spells. There are barely two which are exactly the same. Occasionally, we also see new impulses in the content of the corpus, as in the third intermediate period, when spells are modified and texts were incorporated that did not belong to the corpus before, or in the 26th dynasty, when the whole corpus was fundamentally reorganized. Likewise, the illuminations offered opportunities for individual and alternative forms of details. For example, the more common sledge on which the mummy is being transported to the tomb in the vignette of spell 1 is sometimes replaced by a funerary cart with wheels. Certain iconographical variations and peculiarities in the vignettes seem to reflect local traditions. The vignette of a given spell in the Theban Book of the Dead may look slightly different from the illustration of the same spell book in a Book of the Dead produced in Memphis or Akhmim. If features typical for location X can be found in documents also of site Y, we may assume that a Book of the Dead template has been transferred from one workshop to another. Exchange of papyri and books between temple libraries, even over large distances, must have been a common practice in Pharaonic, Greco Roman, and Coptic Egypt. From the late period onward, copyists would resort to a master copy whose spells followed the standardized and largely fixed sequence of the so-called Saitic recension. Prior to the Saite recension, we encounter a looser arrangement of text with certain preferred sequences of spells. Actual master copies have very rarely survived. One of the scarce specimens is being conserved in the British Museum. It is a late Ptolemaic Book of the Dead, which contains a demotic placeholder, min so and so, instead of the owner's name. For a Book of the Dead master copy on the verso of the literary papyrus Bandier, see Quack 2014, page 115. The most extensive Book of the Dead manuscripts comprise more than 150 spells, but often scribes chose only a selection from this extensive corpus. Accordingly, the length of Book of the Dead documents varies considerably. While some papyri with more than 100 spells are well over 20 meters long, others measure merely a meter with only a few spells and an introductory vignette. The longest examples measure about 40 meters in the second half of the 21st dynasty. Short versions come into use, so called miniature Book of the Dead documents, with a length of 50 centimeters to 2 meters, a reduced sheet height, an opening vignette, and just a few spells. One of the most exemplary specimens is the 89 centimeter long Book of the Dead papyrus of Isit Macbeth, which bears only an opening vignette and the text of spell 136a. The reason for the individual choice of certain spells remains unclear, but for sure it was not at random. Economic factors and personal preferences might have been important factors. A long roll inscribed with spells and decorated with polychrome vignettes must have been a costly funerary good. As we learn from a Ramesside Ostrakhan, a decorated Book of the Dead papyrus of unknown length was worth 1 deban of silver. Hence, its value equals a half year's wage of a workman or the price of 3 donkeys. Shalom, beloved. Scribal notes. I'm reading the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Short scribal notes are among the most important testimonies for work on Book of the Dead exemplars in progress. These short texts, written in hieratic or demotic, offered immediate glimpses of working processes, the internal administration, and logistic organization of the workshops. They are of heterogeneous content and function. In a Book of the Dead from Akhmim, we find demotic numbers at the lower edge of the papyrus. Obviously, the scribe counted the vertical lines in order to calculate either the space that would be needed for the rest of the spell or the text already written. An enigmatic calculation in the Book of the Dead of Nespasifi may similarly refer to the number of papyrus sheets, columns, or spells of the roll, or the expenditure of time for making the document. Scribes and painters would produce several Book of the Dead exemplars at a time and store the completed manuscripts temporarily in the scriptorium. For keeping track, some copyists added the name of the owner on the free edge at the beginning of the papyrus roll or bandages, which made it easier to check for whom the manuscript was meant. Probably in some cases, the notices with names were written on the undecorated papyrus rolls and strips of linen for reserving writing supports in the workshop. In his paper and books in ancient Egypt, Jaroslav Cerny gives a rather critical assessment of the text quality of Book of the Dead documents. It is certain that most scribes took much less care in doing their work of copying Book of the Dead documents, which no eye would ever see, with the result that the Book of the Dead, though it has come down to us in many copies, has done so in a state of extreme corruption. No wonder then that the establishment of its correct text and its interpretation are among the most difficult tasks in Egyptian philology. Though the faultiness of certain exemplars cannot be denied, there are nevertheless clear indications for text revision, collation, and an effort to copy faithfully. As the red notice at the end of the 18th dynasty Book of the Dead papyrus of Uya expressly declares, the book is completed from its beginning to its end as it was found written, having been copied, collated, checked, and corrected sign by sign. This practice is confirmed by clear traces of correction. If text had been forgotten, the reviser added it above the line, as on the mummy wrapping of Amunirdis. Alternatively, an incomplete passage was marked by a sign and the missing words supplemented at the top or bottom of the page. Chapter 6, The Ritual Context of the Book of the Dead by Yekaterina Barbash. For over a century, students of the Egyptian Book of the Dead have researched its contents, history, and meaning in great detail. Still, the ritual context of the composition is not fully understood. It is hard to imagine that the lengthy manuscripts detailing the journey to and through the afterlife were just quietly placed in the tomb in close proximity to the mummy without accompanying actions. So, when, where, and in what capacity were these spells actually used? The answers may be found in the texts themselves, sometimes stated explicitly in a spell's instructions, or in other cases, deduced from the titles, content, or media on which they were written. A spell's occurrence on non mortuary objects may also hint at its ritual context that possibly lies outside the sphere of death. The ritual actions involving Book of the Dead spells vary greatly as they connect with discrete points in one's journey through life, death, and the distant afterlife. As expected, most of these spells figure in rituals of the funeral and mortuary cult for mortuary literature intended for use by the deceased in the afterlife, and funerary liturgies that were enacted for the benefit of the deceased, primarily intended to benefit the deceased. However, many of these spells were also used in rituals by the living, either in anticipation of post mortem transformation or in a completely different non funerary function as temple liturgies or magical and protective incantations. Because books of the dead are compilations of spells rather than true books, chapter 1, copying, reinterpreting, and adding to each manuscript was in itself a complex ritual activity performed by priest scribes. This chapter presents a brief overview of the various rituals surrounding the Book of the Dead. Rituals for the dead. Books of the Dead are above all associated with rituals meant to help the deceased in navigating the perils of the netherworld and in transforming into an Akh, a spirit capable of communicating, moving about, and receiving food and drink. Recited before, during, and after the burial, on subsequent visits to the tomb, these spells were believed to assist one's transfiguration. Instructions at the beginning or end of spells directed the officiant to vocalize the incantations at specified points during embalming, offering, or funerary rites. Many such instructions state the specific time and place of a spell's intended recitation, the location and time of others, and are implied by their titles or context. The directions, however, are distinctly formulaic and should be taken with a grain of salt. For instance, the most common instruction, words to be spoken by PN, the deceased, was not meant literally. While the deceased in the netherworld was perhaps the intended speaker at some point in the history of mortuary literature, by the time this formula appears in the Book of the Dead, it functioned largely to mark breaks in a spell. Rituals before burial. Several spells belonged with rituals that had to be performed before the day of burial, that is, in conjunction with embalming rites that were held soon after death. Although not explicitly identified as such, the place of these spells among pre burial rites is implied by their context. Some spells were part of the hourly wake rituals that were held in the place of embalming on the night before burial, I'm sorry, on the night before burial. More common were instructions for recitation over specific amulets placed on clearly identified body parts, pointing to concurrence with wrapping rituals. The rubric of spell 163 prescribes its reading over two winged Wadjet eyes, a serpent with legs, and other mystical images drawn on fresh linen, with which a man and all his limbs were wrapped. The subsequent spell 164 was to be recited over an image of a three-faced mutt on a red bandage binding the chest of the deceased. Clearly associated with the action of wrapping the embalmed body, the ritual recitation of these spells combined with the magical power of images to protect the deceased in the afterlife. Rituals during the funeral. A number of Book of the Dead spells were part of rituals performed on earth during the funeral, commonly introducing later manuscripts. The vignette extending over spells 1 through 15 represents a classic funeral with a procession to the tomb. Figures 4.8 and 6.1 recitation of spells as well as key burial rituals that are not included in books of the dead, but are alluded to in several spells: offerings, libations, opening of the mouth, sacrifices, and so on. Spell 1 includes the explicit instruction, words to be recited on the day of burial. It directs offering bread, beer, meat, barley, and emmer to the deceased. An integral part of the funeral from the Old Kingdom onward, the offering ritual followed the completion of embalming and relocation of the mummy to its place of burial. The recitation of the offering formula, the so called Hetepdiniswet, probably originally coincided with presentation of actual offerings at the tomb chapel. However, the mere pronunciation of the offering formula at the funeral and during subsequent family visits to the tomb, or its representation on stelae, tomb walls, and other funerary equipment, was often deemed enough to nourish the spirit. Spell 59 for breathing air and having power over water, and spell 62 for drinking water and the realm of the dead are inscribed on several offering tables from tombs in Akhmim for this purpose. Without explicitly citing the ritual of presenting offerings, spell 148 petitions the gods to share with the deceased the classical list of provisions familiar from the Hatip Dineswet formula. Appropriately, when recorded on tomb walls, this spell appears near a stela or statue of the deceased where offerings would be placed. Another significant funerary rite was the opening of the mouth ceremony. With the mummy set upright and facing south in the forecourt of the tomb, priest symbolically opened its mouth, allowing the deceased to consume offerings and communicate. In other words, to become an Ak. The full elaborate ritual involved purification and the sacrifice of a calf, as well as offerings of food, linen, oils, and invocations to various deities. Although the words of this ceremony are not part of the Book of the Dead corpus, the ritual is clearly implied. Spells 21 through 23 concern the mouth of the deceased, with the title of spell 23, formula for opening the mouth of PN or pen, establishing their ritual context. Spell 30, commonly inscribed on heart scarabs as well as other media, instructs the priest, spoken over a scarab, placed in the area of a man's heart after the opening of the mouth ritual is performed on him. Also referring to this important rite are spells 137B and 137A because the spell numbering system was introduced in modern times. The numbers sometimes appear out of order. The first one, spell for kindling the flame, spell 137B, known from a New Kingdom papyrus, relates to lighting torches during the funeral. 137A in turn describes a ritual of extinguishing 4 red cloth torches in milk inside clay basins following the opening of the mouth ceremony. Several hieratic ostraca inscribed with this spell were found in tombs, suggesting that they may have been used by priests during performance at the tomb. Rituals implied by their media. Pieces of funerary equipment consistently inscribed with Book of the Dead spells point to distinct rituals performed in preparation for the funeral or in conjunction with it. These single spells inscribed on these objects typically include instructions specifying the object and providing details of the associated ritual. As a result, each object serves as both record and tool of a ritual involving that same spell. The likely secondary recording of these spells in Book of the Dead manuscripts doubtlessly functioned as a nonverbal stand in for each ritual and assisted in the transmission of the spell. Spell 30 and its variants is typically inscribed on large scarabs of green stone that were placed on the chest of the mummy. The spell appeals to the heart of the deceased, traditionally the seat of one's consciousness, to not oppose him or her at the judgment of Osiris. As mentioned above, this spell was part of the opening of the mouth ritual performed by priests on the day of burial. In the sphere of the divine, it coincided with the weighing of the heart of the deceased after he or she passed all the netherworldly obstacles and reached Osiris's judgment hall. Describing an assortment of objects used in rituals of embalming and the funeral, spell 151 appears on the papyri, tomb walls, stelae, and such funerary equipment as magic bricks, masks, and ushaptis. According to the instructions, the officiants of these and other rituals had to be pure and cleansed, eating neither goat nor fish, and not approaching women. A ritual involving 4 mud bricks placed in niches at cardinal points in the burial chamber is described in spell 151D through G. Each brick inscribed with a distinct spell contained an amulet object, a faience, jed pillar, a recumbent Anubis jackal, a torch, and a wooden mummiform image. The spell was recited in bricks installed immediately following offerings of bread, beer, and incense to the gods. Believed to protect the mummy and tomb, the shape, number, material, and protective function of magic bricks evoke birth bricks upon which mothers squat during birth and the newborn was laid afterward, thereby also assisting one's rebirth. Archaeological evidence shows that the very specific instructions for ritual performance of this spell were rarely followed, instead being replaced by a variety of inventive alternatives. Rather than the specified unbaked clay, red brick was used at times instead of carved Hittite text. Archaeologists found inked, painted, or no inscriptions on the bricks. Instead of covering the face of the 4 niches, either with linen, as was commonly done for ritual objects, or sealing with plaster, up to 10 large, seemingly uncovered niches have been found. Perhaps the instruction was not entirely clear to the ancient Egyptians either. The burial of Tutankhamun contained 5 rather than 4 bricks haphazardly arranged. In non royal tombs, the builders omitted wall niches altogether, placing the bricks directly in the tomb. And finally, the orientation toward cardinal points often followed theoretical orientation or was simply ignored. Since relatively few burials actually include magic bricks, we can assume that either the ritual was not performed very often or an abridged version, not involving physical bricks, was performed. The reference to it on papyrus was possibly deemed enough, although numerous divergences from these very specific instructions of the spell can seem careless. Each variation may in fact be evidence of theological innovation. Titled Spell for a Head of Mystery, spell 151A concerns the mummy mask and is commonly inscribed on masks, papyri, and coffins, like the golden mask and coffin of Tutankhamun, contain this text. The ritual of placing the mask on the deceased echoed the myth where Ra gave a mask to Osiris, healing his injuries. Coffin text spell 531. Mask of later dates additionally record spell 162 for providing heat under the head, also popularly inscribed on hypocephali or decorated discs that were placed under or near the head of a mummy. Interestingly, rather than describing a hypocephalus, the rubric of 162 instructs recitation over another solar symbol, a gold cow amulet placed at the throat of the deceased. Amulets play a significant role in mortuary rituals as they were placed on the body during mummification, wrapping, or burial. They prominently figure in vignettes and instructions to Book of the Dead spells. Despite precise instructions, however, their form and position on mummies vary greatly. Meant to be recited on the day of burial, spells 156 through 159 were pronounced over specific amulets placed at the neck of the deceased, likely coinciding with the very end of embalming and wrapping rituals. Further elaborate ritual preparations include using specified materials, gold, green stone, red jasper, etc., or anointing with the sap of the neem plant strung on sycamore fibers, spell 156. Spell 100 directs its recitation over an image placed on the breast of the deceased without letting it touch the body. Thus, after wrapping, the vignette of this spell, commonly placed on Ptolemaic linen strip amulets, was included in longer Book of the Dead manuscripts in earlier times, suggesting its basically funerary character. Papyri that record single spells from the Book of the Dead corpus perhaps serve the same protective function as amulets. The instruction to be spoken over an image, common to these single spell manuscripts that were placed either at the neck or on the breast of the deceased, also occurred on amulet spells. The rituals involving exclusively gold amulets described by the 26th dynasty papyrus of Montumat also appear as single spells on papyri. Rituals after burial. The ritual performance of some spells took place on occasions following burial. Because the original manuscript was deposited with the deceased, alternate copies of spells were presumably used for this purpose. Including the text on papyrus was likely believed to provide benefit to the deceased through the text's very presence, even if no ritual actually took place post burial. The instructions of spell 190 call for its performance throughout the year on the day of the new moon festival, the sixth day festival, the Wag, Thoth, and Sokar festivals, the birth of Osiris, and the night of Haker. Because such spells likely originated in a temple setting, the instructions may in fact be a remnant from the liturgical use and were not expected to be applied in the funerary context. Rituals for the living. In addition to their well known role in mortuary rites, a considerable number of spells familiar to us from books of the dead, perhaps as many as 55 of the 192 spells, were used in rituals during life. Living Egyptians employed them in temple rituals for personal protection or in preparation for the journey through the afterlife. In fact, a number of Book of the Dead spells that appeared on temple walls or on personal amulets were probably originally composed as temple liturgies or magical incantations and only later adapted for funerary use. The ritual functions of some spells used by the living matched their post-mortem role, but many were intentionally modified for funerary use. At the same time, adaptation also occurred in the opposite direction, where Book of the Dead spells were adjusted to fit earthly rituals. The history of these spells is likely much more complicated, with text being adapted and readapted between mortuary and non mortuary functions throughout the centuries. Spells known from the Book of the Dead were employed in a variety of temple rituals as initiations, hymns, offering spells, and cosmographical texts documenting religious knowledge. Not surprisingly, these spells are particularly common in the context of Osirian mythology, where the deceased and resurrected god Osiris joins the sun god Re or Ra in his cycle through the netherworld to be reborn each day. The similarity between private funerary texts and practices and the temple cult of Osiris suggests mutual influence. Whether conceived in the temple or in the mortuary context, these spells were usually revised to fit the new environment. Thus, spells 110 and 148, recorded in Medinet Habu, omit direct references to death and the afterlife, replacing them with formula for the living king. Rooms 26 and 27 of the Royal Mortuary Complex. Spells 144 through 146 deal with the gates and portals of the netherworld, facilitating the deceased passage through them. Related to the cult of Osiris and Ra, portions of these spells appear on staircases and roofs of Greco Roman temples, like the Dendera roof chapels where Osirian rituals were held during Koic and other festivals. A priest in the guise of a god, like Horus, would have presumably played the role of the deceased in the performance of a ritual that corresponds to the Book of the Dead spell 145, interacting with each gate guardian and passing through the ultimate goal of joining Osiris. A new kingdom hymn to Osiris was later absorbed into the Book of the Dead corpus as spell 128. In the original temple ritual, the gods Horus, Thoth, Isis, and Nephthys mentioned in this spell were surely played by priests before a statue of Osiris. In the mortuary adaptation, the deceased, him or herself, was the first person speaker. According to its rubric, this ritual coincided with offerings at the Wag festival, an important funerary feast celebrated in the first month of the year. Solar hymns, commonly found on stelae, Catnas 28 through 29, pyramidia, and tomb walls, were codified into spell 15 during the Saite recension. A hymn to the rising sun, known from Karnak, Medinet Habu, Deir al Bari, and Luxor temples, parallels spell 15b. Judging by the scene of the king offering to the sun god next to this hymn on the edifice of Taharka in Karnak, the text was here part of an offering ritual. There is no question of the significance of offerings in both funerary Book of the Dead spells and earthly temple rituals. One common example, spell 148, appears in 8 different temples, in several cases more than once. typically accompanied by images of 7 cows and a bull in front of offering tables in Book of the Dead manuscripts. Spell 148 was likely recited in conjunction with offerings on the day of burial and during 7 different festivals. The scenes occurrences in temples were linked with offerings presented to the gods. Death and burial may be seen as a form of initiation, and the theme of initiation holds a significant place among spells that intersect the temple and mortuary spheres. The address to Osiris, negative confession, or the deceased denial of committing a list of 42 sins during life, and the weighing of the heart vignette in one of the most popular Book of the Dead spells, number 125, seem at first glance to be purely mortuary in character. Nevertheless, the use of this spell in temples is well attested. Its title in Book of the Dead manuscripts is Spell for Entering the Hall of the Two Truths, while the rubric states, One shall utter this spell pure and clean. The declaration of innocence and purity required before the deceased enters the presence of the gods easily parallels the purification of officiating priests before performing the daily temple ritual. The vignette of this spell in the Book of the Dead of Neferwebenev forms an interesting link between the spell's temple and funerary functions. Neferwebenev is depicted entering a door before the tribunal of 42 gods as a well dressed man with shoulder length hair and exiting the shrine as a priest with a shaved head and dressed in linen, ritually prepared to see a god, in this case Osiris. The function of spell 125 in priestly initiations extended into the Greco Roman world. An early 2nd century AD novel by Apuleius describes an initiation of the protagonist Lucius into the mystery cult of Isis in Corinth. Following Egyptian customs, Lucius's initiation involved purification, abstaining from certain foods, assertion of innocence, and forgiveness from the gods. The remarkable similarity between the negative confession of spell 125 and purity oaths sworn by Roman period priests further attests to direct influence. Outside of official temple ceremonies, rituals involving Book of the Dead spells and vignettes were believed to provide magical protection to the living. Spell 140 employs recitation over a Wajit's eye amulet, a symbol of healing and magical protection. Said over a Wajit eye of real lapis lazuli, or he looks like hematite stone set in gold. Also, make another eye of red jasper, which a man may place on any limb he prefers. Elaborate instructions describe when the ritual is to be performed. When Ra shows himself on the last day of month 2 of the 2nd season. The choice of limb for applying the amulet and the very specific date suggests that this incantation was part of a ritual for the protection of an individual during life. Similarly, spell 18, recording rituals vindicating Osiris or the deceased against his enemies, also appears in a magical medical papyrus, likely originally composed for the living as a magical charm. Its application on Earth was believed to protect and ward off potential dangers. The spell appropriately includes the clause, everyone upon whom this is recited, it means being prosperous on Earth. An interesting category of spells with primarily funerary purposes was used by the living in preparation for their journey through the afterlife. The rubric of spell 20, for example, describes such a ritual. If a man recites this spell and purifies himself with natron water, it assures going forth after mooring. or death. Creating the books of the dead. The spell selection sequences and vignettes of each individual Book of the Dead depended to some extent on the choice of the owner and availability of funds. However, the ultimate decision on a manuscript's details was to the scribe and the trends preferred by his workshop. The scribes who created, copied, and compiled these books were also priests and scholars. Their contribution may be seen in the originality and internal consistency of most manuscripts, even of the shortest kind. Scribes produced new meaning and nuance by adding new passages, reinterpreting them, altering words or entire spells, or correcting a perceived error. The scribal revisions that attempt to better understand and explain what they were copying should be seen as a ritual act. Originally comprised of second intermediate period coffin text, Books of the Dead incorporated new material during the New Kingdom. Later scribes continued enriching them with non funerary text of applicable power. Scribal workshops likely maintained master copies of groups of spells and full sequences. Scribes copied from more than one source, combined the sources at their individual discretion, and incorporated their interpretations within the spell they were copying. They used phrases like kaida or kair, another saying or another spell, respectively, to introduce alternatives in Book of the Dead spells. Adding another version of a spell conceivably strengthened the efficacy and perhaps provided a deeper understanding of complex text. From early on, spell 17 incorporates this process. Cryptic passages of this spell conclude with the question, "What is it?" usually followed by a no less obscure explanation. The Sayyid canonization must have involved years of systematic research into earlier manuscripts, archives, and monuments. The subsequent abbreviation of spells or omission of parts thereof, as well as specific choices from the available groups, certainly held meaning. Although spoken Egyptian of the late period significantly diverged from the language of the spells, most changes within spells were intentional rather than errors. The revisions demonstrate that scribes understood the textual nuance of spells composed in an archaic dialect. Throughout the entire history of Books of the Dead, the constant modification of spells demonstrates a deliberate attempt to improve understanding and efficacy for the living and deceased users.